Okay, everybody, we're going to talk about something called the best years now that comes out of Reeves' book. Um, if we kind of talk about the best years, this is going to be the time period after the Korean War up until November 22nd, 1963, and we'll talk about the significance of that date in a bit. We did see a lot of growth and prosperity here. We had advances in nutrition and medicine, which keep people alive longer. Kind of similar to what we have now, where I think the median, I mean the age, average age that somebody lives to is in their 80s now. It wasn't like that before. We also started to see a population boom, what was called, the baby boom. Uh, Population climbed to 179 million. The number of households grew from 37.5 million in 1945 to nearly 53 million in 1960. People started moving out west as well. The Pacific states became a lot more populated, and by 1963, California was the most populous state. We also saw a rise in income. Unemployment was about 5%, and generally, any type of your unemployment's anywhere from 4 to 5%. That's pretty good. As comparison, right now in 2020, um, our unemployment rate is at about 11% currently. And between 1945 and 1960, about 500 people had about $500 to about 1800. It went from 500 to $1,800 in disposable income per capita. Now Reeves is a little bit uh, kind of, I don't want to say misleading, but I would define disposable income as the income that you have left over after you pay your taxes and bills. Kind of money that's left over to go out to dinner, to go to movies, to go to a sporting event, and so on. Um, I'm not quite sure if he and I have the same uh, definition of disposable income, but I still think that even for now, it's a lot to have $1,800 left over uh, each paycheck. In disposable income. That's the way I would define it, but he might have a different definition that he doesn't really go into. We also saw a lot of automation. We saw labor saving devices coming out that took away a lot of blue collar jobs, and as a result, white collar workers eventually outnumbered blue collar workers. We started to see a religious revival as well. The number of churches increased, the number of church membership increased, and 49% of people reported having attended a church or a synagogue in the past week. That'd be interesting to compare some of the numbers to today, because I think church membership has gone down as people kind of detach themselves from organized religion and still practice, maybe Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism. Um, but it'd be really interesting to see a stat, 2020, to see how many people actually believe in God. Now, I know in the 90s that was up to 95%. Now it's probably down to roughly 78, 79%, the last numbers I saw. Um, and at the same time, 81% of people expressed the belief that religion could answer all their questions or all life's problems. That'd be another interesting thing to look at now. Eisenhower, who was president at times, tried to bring a lot more religiosity to the country. He established a national day of prayer and opened his cabinet meetings with prayer. Um, the words "under God" were soon added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and "In God We Trust" became the nation's official motto. We also were in a space race, between the Soviets and the United States. NASA was developed in order to try to win that space race. Eventually, the Soviets were the first to um, launch into space, but obviously in 1970, the United States beat the Soviets to the moon. We also started to see a huge increase in defense. By 1960, the United States had developed intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach targets up to 7,000 miles away. And Kennedy, in his early years, strategically deployed ICBMs throughout underground sites across the U.S. The George Washington, which was a sub, launched its first Polaris missile and soon a fleet of submarines could deploy missiles that could reach targets up to 2,900 miles away. And a lot of this was to practice that whole domino theory that we're gonna, get into a little bit. At the time, we're also on the brink of World War III. Castro, who had started a revolution in Cuba, kind of ushering in, communist ideology, was the subject of a lot of CIA plots to assassinate the Cuban leader. A lot of Cuban expatriates were advocating this, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit. Plans were eventually laid out to mount an invasion of Cuba by expatriates trained and supported by the United States. John F. Kennedy, who was elected president in one of the closest elections, was the one to determine whether or not this invasion would proceed. As one of the last acts in 1961, the U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Cuba. We also had problems going on in Southeast Asia, right? France attempted to reassert its authority over a colony that was a one-time colony named Vietnam. The Vietnamese had fought the Japanese during the war and sought independence. It became a struggle that was really evident with our Cold War. Ho Chi Minh, who was a Vietnamese leader, combined that nationalism that we talked about with communism. Remember, nationalism is the belief that your country's superior, one culture, one language, all of that stuff mixed in with communism. The U.S. came to believe in what was called the domino theory, and that was the belief that if one country fell to communism, all the neighboring countries around it would fall also. And between 55 and 61, the U.S. poured more than $1 billion into South Vietnam, most of it in military aid. We also started to have strained relations with the USSR. These tensions were escalated when the Soviets shut down a U-2 CIA spy plane. And combined with this U-2 incident and Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Russian premier at the time, he walked out of a peace summit in Paris. This escalated Cold War tensions and kind of intensified the arms race. 1960 presidential election, Kennedy won by 0.1% in the popular vote. A mere 112,803 votes separated Kennedy and Nixon, and this was the closest election of the 20th century. Now, right at the beginning of the 21st century, we actually saw the closest election ever, where Gore lost to Bush by about 594 votes in Florida, and we'll get into we talked about the Electoral College and some of the things about that, and I had a video about the end of this election which talks about that. But in this case with Kennedy, African Americans tipped the scales for Kennedy in several states because Kennedy was an ardent supporter of civil rights. Kennedy ranked Vietnam as the number one threat to world stability in a speech to the UN. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of religious differences, and a lot of successes by the Viet Cong guerrillas who weakened the South Vietnamese army of Ngo Diem. Diem was a Catholic, and public protests over the repression of Buddhists threatened the stability of the regime. We started to increase flow of military advisors to Vietnam, up to 16,000. And also at that time, Kennedy had pressured Diem to kind of clean house in his government and to institute long overdue reforms both politically and economically. Now, this comes up to also another point in on our history when we talk about something called the Bay of Pigs. During this time, the State Department, with cooperation with the CIA, attempted to push Castro from power, which we talked a little about earlier. In April of 1961, the CIA launched what its leaders believed would be a definitive strike, a full-scale invasion of Cuba by 1,400 American-trained Cubans who had fled Cuba after Castro took over during the revolution. On April 15th, 1961, a group of Cuban exiles took off from Nicaragua in a squadron of American B-26 bombers that looked like stolen Cuban planes, and they were going to construct a strike against a Cuban airfield. However, Castro knew about this raid. He had many advisors and many informants who knew what was going on, and he moved his planes from where the strike was going to be. The Cuban exile brigade began its invasion at an isolated spot on the island of Cuba's south shore, known as the Bay of Pigs. The CIA tried to keep it a secret, but a radio station on the beach broadcasted every detail of the operation to listeners across Cuba, so the Cubans were definitely ready. Unexpected coral reefs sank some of the exile ship as they pulled in the shore. Paratroopers also landed in the wrong place, so as you can see, this was a total failure. When all was completed, about 114 were killed and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. The CIA and the Cuban exile kind of believed that Kennedy would provide air support to the American military to intervene in Cuba on their behalf, but it never came. As much as he didn't want to abandon Cuba to the communists, he didn't want to start World War III. And this led also to something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Operation Mongoose was designed to do what the Bay of Pigs invasion failed to do, and that was to remove communist Castro from power. During the summer of '62, the Soviets started to send troops, technicians, weapons, tanks over into Cuba. There were more than 40,000 troops in Cuba and 270,000 armed Cubans at the peak of the crisis. One of the concerns is that, Cuba being so close in proximity to the U.S., and the Soviets and the Cubans were pointing weapons at the United States, and in retaliation, the United States went into Turkey and pointed missiles at the Soviets. The Soviets had argued that this was a defensive strategy, but the United States took it as a sign of aggression. For 13 days, the U.S. was on the brink of nuclear war. And at the time, JFK also sought the Navy to establish a blockade of the island by preventing the Soviets from delivering additional missiles and military equipment to the island. He would also deliver an ultimatum that all existing missiles be removed. Eventually, a compromise was worked, and the USSR withdrew from Cuba while the U.S. removed missiles from Turkey. Now, this kind of leads us to what can be signified as the end of Camelot, a term that was used to describe, JFK's administration. Now, we could probably go down a rabbit hole and really look at the assassination, but, some things are kind of iffy when you really take a look at it. I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but this is one of the conspiracy theories that I believe in. And, the official account is that Lee Harvey Oswald shot John F. Kennedy in the back of the head from a book depository building in Dallas, Texas. One shooter, there was a film that came out after called the Zapruder film, which was a kind of a home video that was taken by Abraham Zapruder, who was just a citizen that was taking video that kind of puts a hole in the one shooter theory. The video is up on YouTube, and it shows us Kennedy getting shot from the back, and then it shows him getting his shot from the front. And I'm not quite sure that's really disputable. So if you want to take a look at it on your own, it's called the Zapruder film, Zapruder. And it's like a couple minutes. And, there's definitely some questions about the assassination that still exist today. I don't think we'll ever really know the answer on who killed JFK. If you watch the movie JFK that's made by Oliver Stone, that's a pretty good synopsis of some of the theories. But, with that being said, we're probably really never going to know what happened. Okay? So this kind of signifies the end of the great years, where now we're going to go into a decade of turmoil where, we have, the 60s Vietnam War, a lot of protests, a lot of division. And we'll talk about that in the next part of the history portion of this class. Okay? Thanks a lot.